Hey everyone, this is sort of like a last minute video I decided to make. In this video, I'm actually going to be commenting on another video that I actually seen on my Twitter feed towards the end of last week. And actually, it comes from Politico. I'd actually shared it on my Twitter feed with a few sort of brief comments, but I thought that I'd make a slightly lengthier video. It's still going to be kind of short, but a video in which I go into what President Biden said in this speech with a little bit more depth. And the speech in question was a speech made by President Biden on the occasion of him signing into effect an executive order in which he tries to expand upon access to contraception and abortion. And this obviously comes in response to the recent Supreme Court case overthrowing Roe v. Wade. But without further ado, let's get into the video itself.
I'm asking the Justice Department that, much like they did in the civil rights era, to do something, do everything in their power to protect these women seeking to invoke their rights. In states where clinics are still open, to protect them from intimidation, to protect the right of women to travel from a state that prohibits seeking the medical attention that she needs to a state to provide that care, to protect the woman's right to the FDA-approved, Federal Drug Administration approved medication that's been available for over 20 years.
So basically, my main comment on this is note what he does here. And he takes a very, what I would consider a very sneaky approach. But basically, what he does here is he equates the pro-choice movement with the civil rights movement. And the reason why I would find that to be problematic is because no one takes an issue, or at least very few people in mainstream American society take issue with the civil rights movement. But by equating the pro-choice movement with the civil rights movement back in the 1950s and 1960s, basically what he's doing is he's taking something controversial, something about which there's a lot of division in American society, and trying to make it acceptable by comparing it to something about which there's a lot of agreements, you know? And basically, by doing that, he's trying to make it seem like the struggles that women are going through to try to get access to abortion and contraception are the same as the struggles that African Americans and other minorities went through back in the middle of the last century and before to try to get their civil rights. And the entire point is, by making this equation, he's basically making it seem like anyone who's against abortion is trying to regulate or take away the rights of women. Nobody is against women's rights. No one is against the notion of everyone, including women, having bodily autonomy. But the reason why a lot of people tend to support the pro-life movement, or at the very least have issues with the pro-choice movement, is because of certain deeper moral considerations. Are there people out there who are bigoted against women or want to control women? Yeah. But that's not representative of the majority of the pro-life movement. Basically, whether or not you think the attempt on the part of some women to get access to abortion and contraception is the same as, what African Americans had to go through in the civil rights movement really depends on your view on the nature of the unborn child. If a fetus, if an unborn child is not a living thing, or if it is a living thing, but it doesn't have the status of a person, then that means it's basically just an extension of the mother's body. In which case, attempts to either regulate or outlaw abortion are attempts to control or regulate the rights of women and women's bodies. But if the fetus is a living thing, and more specifically, if it is the type of living thing that we can consider to be a person, then that means the fetus isn't just an extension of the mother's body. Unborn children are not simply an extension of their mothers. They are distinct persons with rights and privileges equal to those of the mother. And so the worst case scenario is the minute you acknowledge that the latter is true, that unborn babies are still persons with rights equal to that of the mother. Again, the worst case scenario is you would still end up supporting abortion, but you would realize the situation's way more complex than you previously made it seem, because you're still taking an innocent life. That is to say, you're taking the life of a person who hasn't done anything to deserve being killed. On the other on the other hand, the best case scenario, at least for pro-lifers, is that the minute you begin to recognize that unborn babies are persons of a dignity equal to that of the mother, then you'll end up becoming pro-life. But again, how you view the debates surrounding abortion, depends on how you view the nature of abortion, which again depends on how you view the nature of an unborn child, the moral and ontological status of an unborn child. The same is true with contraception. You know, if you think that contraception is a morally illicit way of regulating how many children you have, then of course you think that both women and men should have basically unlimited access to contraception. That the only regulations on contraception and abortion would be, are the methods of abortion and contraception um, medically safe? But if you believe that contraception violates the fundamental nature of marriage and human sexuality according to the natural law or according to the will of God, however you want to frame it, um, then basically you would believe that contraception is an unnatural and therefore immoral way of regulating the number of children you end up having. And again, President Biden should know this as someone who identifies as Catholic. As someone who identifies as Catholic, he should know that all of this is the official stance of the Catholic Church. But of course, he uses these sort of sneaky methods to try to get people to become more sympathetic towards the pro-choice movement. But with that in mind, let's continue on.
Patient comes into an emergency room in any state in the union. She's expressing and experiencing life-threatening miscarriage. But the doctor is going to be so concerned about being criminalized for treating her, they delay treatment to call the hospital lawyer, who is concerned the hospital will be penalized if the doctor provides the life-saving care.
So basically, this is where things start to get a little bit more complicated. What are your views on abortion in instances in which the mother's life is at stake? And the general opinion of Catholic theologians is that if a pregnant woman is suffering from a life-threatening medical issue, and the only way to deal with it is by doing something that will result in the death of the child, such a medical procedure would be allowable if the death of the child is an unforeseen or unintended or sort of like secondary consequence of the medical procedure. And the reason why a lot of Catholic theologians say this is because this is the result of what's called the principle of double effect, which basically says that an action that has both positive and negative moral consequences is morally acceptable if, one, the action in question is either inherently morally good or inherently morally neutral. Obviously, actions that are by nature inherently morally evil are never acceptable, even if they have some sort of positive consequences. So the action has to be in itself inherently morally good or inherently morally evil. Two, the positive consequences have to outweigh the negative moral consequences. And three, you act for the sake of the positive moral consequences. Now, obviously, according to the principle of double effect, doing something that is not directly taking the life of an unborn child, but which results in the death of an unborn child as an unforeseen or unintended or sort of like secondary or indirect consequence is different than doing something that sort of directly or intentionally results in the death of an unborn child. And again, the reason why this is such a big deal is because we view unborn children as one, living beings with rights equal to those of the mother, but also, second of all, as being innocent persons, people who did nothing wrong, who did nothing to deserve being killed. Now, the thing is, everything I just said is the general opinion of most Catholic theologians. To the best of my knowledge, the Catholic Church hasn't actually come up with a specific stance on how to deal with abortions in this specific set of circumstances. I could be wrong, and so if I am wrong, feel free to correct me in the comment section. But like I've seen the Catholic Church deal with similar situations. For example, Pope Paul VI, in his 1968 encyclical Humani Vitae, asked the question, what happens if a person is undergoing a medical procedure that, as an unintended or unforeseen consequence, results in sterilization or um, becoming infertile? Is that morally the same as intentional sterilization, which would be a form of contraception? And Paul VI answered no. So he did see a distinction between those two things. And so there is a general trend within Catholic theology of seeing a distinction between intentionally and directly doing something evil versus trying to do something good and something evil results as an unintended or unforeseen consequence. There's different levels of culpability in that. Um, and so, what a lot of Catholic moral theologians have done is take certain principles that are already well established in Catholic moral theology, so the Church's pro life stance and the principle of double effect, and sort of applying that to this specific situation. Now, again, I could be wrong. The Catholic Church, in its official magisterial documents, could have at some point officially said, yes, this is the Catholic Church's stance on abortion in cases where the mother's life is at risk. But to the best of my knowledge, it hasn't actually made such a statement. And the reason for that is because, just in general, but especially in the West, instances where pregnancy causes the death of the mother or puts the mother's life at stake are relatively rare. I actually did some research on some numbers, and unfortunately, there was actually in the past few years an increase in the number of women who died during childbirth. But to put it in context, it still isn't that high. So, for example, in 2019 in the United States, there were 754 women who died during childbirth, as opposed to 861 in 2020. But that's only the same as about 23.8 deaths for every 100,000 live births. That's 0.0238% of all births that result in the death of the mother. Ectopic pregnancies are a little bit harder to monitor, but according to the research that I found, some estimates say that about 1 in 50 pregnancies end up as ectopic pregnancies. Concerning miscarriages, there are a variety of issues that may increase the odds of a person's pregnancy ending up in miscarriage. But one of the things that really puts you at risk is age. So basically, the older you are, the more likely you are to have a pregnancy that ends in miscarriage. And so like, let's just say you're a young mother, someone in your 20s or 30s, or even a teenage mother. Supposing you don't have any of the other medical issues that would increase the odds of your pregnancy ending up as a miscarriage, the odds of your pregnancy ending up as a miscarriage are actually much lower. So, for example, numbers put out from an article by the CDC this year say that the odds of a miscarriage taking place within the first 20 weeks for a woman between the ages of 20 and 30 is 8.9%, whereas that number for women over the age of 40 increases to 74.7%. This isn't new information. An article put forward, I believe it was around the year 2000 or so, by the National Center for Biomedical Information, did a survey of pregnancies done that took place between 1978 and 1990, and it showed that 1/5 of all pregnancies for women over the age of 35 ended in a miscarriage, and 54.5% of all pregnancies in women over the age of 42 ended in miscarriage. Another article said that the average rate of miscarriage for women in their 20s is between 12 and 15%, whereas by the time you get to the age of 40, that number increases to 25%. So for women who don't have any other issues that could increase the chances of their pregnancy ending up with a miscarriage, um, basically, this isn't really much of an issue. And this isn't that much of an issue in general because the average age of at least having your first pregnancy is still relatively young. In an article that I saw um, containing numbers from 2014, it said that the average age of that women have their first pregnancy in this country is 26. Even an article from the New York Times from 2016 showed the most common ages for women to have their first pregnancy are between the ages of 19 and 32. Even as recently as 1980, now note that this is 1980s America, not, the 1880s Quebec or like 1890s, you know, Clary or like, you know, 1380s Europe or like, certain third world countries today. This is like America today, um, or America in the end of the 20th century. The average, the most common ages for first time pregnancies were between the ages of 17 and 27. The same article also had an interactive map in which you could go county by county in this country and see the average age of marriage. And in the county that I live in, so I actually live in Kent County, which is sort of like in the middle of the state of Rhode Island. The average age of first-time pregnancies is 28. You saw the same age in Chester County, Pennsylvania. In Westchester County, New York, the average age for first-time pregnancies is 29. In Middlesex County, Massachusetts, the average age of first-time pregnancies was 30. In Marin County, California, the average age of first-time pregnancies was 31. And all of that is considered on the older end of the spectrum. When you go to places like the southern United States and large parts of the Midwest, the average age of first-time pregnancies tends to be considerably younger, usually in your, early to mid-20s. I mean, I saw some counties in some parts of the country where the average age of first-time pregnancies is like 20 or 21. Um, so the vast majority of women in this country are actually getting pregnant at the time in which they're least likely to end up with a miscarriage. And the reason why I say that is because President Biden used as his hypothetical an instance where a woman has a miscarriage, but the miscarriage is such that it threatens the life of the mother. Um, Now, I'm not saying that we should put aside or minimalize or be cold-hearted with regard to, um, you know, issues where pregnancy could result in the life of the mother. I don't think that's trivial, and I don't think that we should take an emotionally hard approach to it. But what I do believe is that, again, while I still think abortion and contraception would be wrong, at the very least, I would understand where you're coming from if you're saying, okay, we're only going to allow abortion and contraception in instances where the mother's life is at stake. In instances of ectopic pregnancy or miscarriages, but the complications resulting from which could increase the odds of the woman dying. Or if a woman gets pregnant and the pregnancy makes worse some other medical issue. Like, I would understand wanting to have access to abortion in those instances. But we know that large chunks of the pro-choice movement, not necessarily President Biden, but that a lot of activists within the pro-choice movement basically want access to abortion and contraception just across the board. And they really would take issue, like if a state were to say, okay, we're going to limit abortion to these very specific and extreme situations, there's a lot of people in the pro-choice movement who would take issue even with that. And so that's the whole point. Um, and so I don't necessarily think that it follows morally or logically that just because a woman's life is in danger in these very specific and limited circumstances, that we should allow for widespread and sweeping access to contraception and abortion. All it proves at best is that contraception and abortion would be morally permissible in those very specific and extreme situations. It doesn't show that it's morally justifiable for to get an abortion or to use contraception in moral or ethical situations that are less high stakes. But even then, there are ethical alternatives based on the principle of double effect, as I proved before. So it isn't like the only logical moral conclusion in these extreme circumstances is contraception and abortion. But let's move on.
It's outrageous. I don't care what your position is. It's outrageous. And it's dangerous.
All right, so basically, of course, that really depends on where you stand on the issue of abortion or contraception to begin with. If you're opposed to contraception and abortion, then obviously it's because you hold certain moral first principles that obviously President Biden and his supporters aren't supporting, right? So, but if you have certain presuppositions that would lead to the pro-life movement, then of course saying that you don't support abortion in any instance, or saying that you only support abortion in these extreme situations, that conclusion makes a lot more sense if you first hold certain moral presuppositions. You know, whereas if you don't hold those presuppositions, then obviously it seems ridiculous. But again, President Biden is only looking at things from his particular set of presuppositions. And I understand. He's a politician. He's not an ethicist. He's not a moral theologian. He's not a lawyer. He's not teaching a class on biomedical ethics. He's not teaching a class on biology or a med school class. He's a politician making a speech. His job here is not to have this in-depth moral debate about the nature of abortion and the moral and biomedical first principles that people hold to that would justify either the pro-life or pro-choice position. But you see how important it is to have these discussions? Because a politician on national television is not going to have these debates. But you see how for the average person, speeches like this tends to reinforce an agenda or a world view that they already have. And you see that's where the problem comes in, right? Because The problem is that the average person also thinks and talks this way. How anything that is what they disagree with is just ridiculous. Ridiculous, man. So, so you see how having these in-depth ethical and spiritual and legal debates, which necessarily includes an analysis of first principles and presuppositions, that's important, and also shows how culture and politics are closely connected. Because you see how by talking like this, he's basically just like pushing an agenda, right? He's just basically continuing to push the agenda of it, or the narrative of this is just nonsense. These extreme pro-lifers are just talking nonsense. Um, but again, this is what really gets under my skin. People who, um, you know, don't actually take the time to realize that people have distinct presuppositions than themselves, and they just say it's ridiculous. No matter what you think, it's all just ridiculous to disagree with whatever I'm saying. And again, it depends on what your larger worldview is. And that's why, in order for us to have, the pro-life and the pro-choice movement are so different that they're talking past each other. So that's why before we can have these in-depth discussions or debates, we need to first have a discussion or debate, or at least get out into the open what your underlying presuppositions are, you know? So let's continue.
That's why this executive order directs the Department of Health and Human Services, HHS, to ensure all patients, including pregnant women and girls, get emergency care they need under federal law, and the doctors have clear guidance on their own responsibilities and protections, no matter what state they're in. The executive order protects access to contraceptions that I'm about to sign. Justice Thomas himself said that under the reasoning of this decision, that the court should reconsider the constitutional right to contraception, to use contraception, even among married couples. And what century are they in? The executive.
Yeah, so basically that's not an argument. Saying, what century are you in, man? That's not an argument. You know, that doesn't prove anything about anything. That's just basically an ad hominem. He's just saying Justice Thomas's um, opinions are outdated, therefore they're wrong. Well, an opinion can be an opinion that was more popular in the past than in the present and still be right. Just like an opinion can be a new opinion that no one's ever held before and be right. Simply being a novel opinion doesn't mean that it's wrong. Likewise, simply being an old opinion, an opinion that not a lot of people accept anymore, doesn't mean it's wrong. Unpopular or obscure opinions are not wrong inherently. With that in mind, if he's going to go down this path, I'm gonna just go down this path too. Things like contraception and abortion, undermine the nature of parenthood and human sexuality. They undermine human dignity in the case of unborn children, and they've been one of the forces that have destroyed the family in the West. You know, and so if I can just make that, if President Biden can just say, "Oh, that opinion's outdated," and just assert that, I can just assert what I just said. And this is something that President Biden should already believe in as a Catholic. The one thing that at least you can't blame Justice Thomas for is being inconsistent, because I believe Justice Thomas is also a Catholic. So it's like, at least he's accepting legal positions that are to some degree consistent with his private moral and religious views. Which, is thus proves that the state of the Catholic politician in this country is sad and pathetic. if you see a lot of politicians like Biden and Pelosi who are so willing to be so openly inconsistent in their views, but it is what it is. So let's continue.
Executive order directs HHS to identify ways to expand access to reproductive health services, like IUDs, birth control pills, emergency contraception. And equally important, this executive order protects patient privacy and access to information. Right now, when you use a search engine or the app on your phone, companies collect your data. They sell it to other companies, or they even share it with law enforcement. There's an increasing concern that extremist governors and others will try to get that data off of your phone, which is out there in the ether, to find what you're seeking, where you're going, and what you're doing with regard to your health care. Talk about no privacy. This executive order asks the FTC to crack down on data brokers that sell private information to extreme groups, or in my view, sell private information to anybody. It establishes a task force led by the White House Department and the Department of Human Services, focused specifically on using every federal tool available to protect access to reproductive health care.
So basically, and the last part is he does the same thing that he did in the beginning. Remember how in the beginning he equated the pro-choice movement with the civil rights movement? He's doing the same thing here. I'm not a big fan of big businesses or the government monitoring your internet searches. I mean, I understand that by the time you use the internet, to some degree, you're already kind of putting yourself out in the public. But like, I don't want internet service providers to make my private information about what sort of stuff I'm looking at on the internet known to the world. I don't want the government doing that. Unless it's an issue where they believe that the good of society or the good of other people is at stake with like legal issues. Take, for example, issues of like child pornography or terrorism. One way in which people can, get in trouble for like or one piece of evidence that they can use against people in a lot of different crimes is looking at your internet history. Because, people are selling drugs on the dark web. Terrorists have used the internet to connect with one another, to coordinate their plans. The minute you type in anything about child pornography on the internet, the government is going to start tracking you. But there you're dealing with the well-being of people, and so I agree. If I look up anything, no matter how weird it may be, no matter what it is, unless it's illegal or something that threatens the well-being of others, I don't want big businesses or the government tracking that information. I don't want them selling that information to others or making that information public. I do believe people have a right to privacy, and it becomes a lot more difficult to enforce that in the age of the internet, but we do need to find ways to enforce it. But the fact of the matter is, everyone supports a right to privacy, but the issue of abortion is a little bit more controversial. So note how he's trying to connect his reforms of, current abortion and contraception laws, he's trying to connect that with right to privacy issues, you know. And I think he doesn't explicitly say this here, but I think that subconsciously he's feeding into the larger narrative of abortion being an individual medical procedure would fall under, or a medical procedure that individuals receive somehow falls under the category of like a right to privacy issue. That's certainly a legal argument that people have used. And so it's not so much what President Biden explicitly says. If I want to look up something about abortion, or if I want to look up a list of all my local abortion clinics, I don't think that information should be sold to the government. But again, he's trying to connect this with the larger legal question of whether or not abortion is defended by the right to privacy, which would be okay if you believe that the fetus wasn't a person. But insofar as you believe that a fetus is a person, then that means that your actions affect other people. So it's not just a bodily autonomy question. It's not just a right to privacy question. You know, if the fetus is a person with rights equal to that of the mother. Um, but a lot of people, at least a lot of pro-choicers, will take the discussion in the direction, in some way, in the direction of right to privacy issues. And it's almost like, you know, killing people is not like using guns to kill people and trying to outlaw that is not a Second Amendment issue. Likewise, if abortion is truly murder, as pro-lifers say it is, then outlawing or regulating abortion or using legal means to stop women from getting abortions or penalizing doctors who give abortions is not a right to privacy issue, and it's not a bodily autonomy issue. Now, we could have a discussion about, how heavy-handed of an approach the government should take in trying to stop abortion. But again, the right to privacy issue is really, it really ends up not amounting to much if you don't necessarily buy into the basic ethical presuppositions of the pro-choice movement. But that's essentially what I want to talk about with you guys today. And I just want to say thank you for joining me. For those of you who are new, I hope you continue to watch our videos, and I hope you learn a lot. And for those in my audience who are members of the pro-life movement, I just want to say keep up the fight. As I said in my last pro-life video, just because we overturned Roe v. Wade doesn't mean that the issue is solved. And President Biden's decisions demonstrate that. So I just wanted to say thank you for joining me today, and God bless.